going to be in the kingdom.
Right, and this whole thing is the kingdom of God is the rule of God both in the individual and in the corporate. It's not just one or the other. It's the rule of God in the heart of the individual, and it's the rule of God on the corporate level. Ultimately, the whole world. Everything that God is doing is ultimately coming back to this kingdom that he is building, where the kingdom will be established here. And his rule and reign will be here. But then if the rule and reign of God happens here, he gets to set the rules. The rules come from him. So the question becomes then, are we willing to align ourselves with those rules now, or are we going to wait till he comes in order to align ourselves? Either way, it's going to happen. Either way, it's going to happen. You can do it now, or you can do it later. One or the other will happen, or both. Yes?
I was going to say also with the acacia building on what Bill said is that when you look at those words in Hebrew, it always says acacia wood. And acacia means pierced, and wood, one of the words for wood is carpenter. So when it says you build the ark out of acacia wood, you build it out of acacia wood, it's building that whole temple out of Yeshua. I mean, it's really awesome.
Picture. Cool. All this tabernacle is a picture of the work that Yeshua is doing. Now, I want to go back to, moving back to our 1 Kings text just for a moment. Hiram provides from Lebanon cedars for the building of the temple. David wanted to build a temple. He wanted to build God a house. 2 Samuel chapter 7, David comes to God and says, to the prophet Nathan, and says, I want to build God a house. That's an interesting text. By the way, here's one for you. Nathan says, I want to build God a house. Nathan the prophet says, hey David, that's a great idea, building God a house. Until God visits Nathan in a dream and says, Nathan, David can't do it. Now David can gather all the material, but he can't build it for me. Now why can't David build it? Well, it's going to be a house of peace. It's going to be a place of life. And David's got his hands in a lot of blood. He's been a man of war. He's a warrior. The person I want to build it is going to be a man who is a man of peace. Oh, well, what do you know? Shlomo, built off this idea of shalom, peace. Okay? Solomon is going to build it. But Hiram is going to, for a price, provide cedars, and then he'll float down the Mediterranean so that they can get them to the place they need to go. Now, it says, interesting text, if you read it, it says that Hiram loved Solomon. What does that mean? Let me suggest that it means this. They were both in covenant with each other. They had a covenant, and covenant terminology is love. So it's the idea of service. Hiram served Solomon because of the treaty and the covenant that they had with each other. Okay? They were in a contractual arrangement. So Hiram provides from Lebanon provides the cedars for the temple. That word love there that's used in Kings is the idea that covenant. Everything God does, please listen to this, everything that God does, i.e. Yeshua, is based on covenant. It's always foundation anchored in covenant. Now the question becomes, how are we connected to those covenants? How are we connected to those covenants? Now, I want to then fast forward for just a moment to the tabernacle. Take your Bibles with me and go to Exodus chapter 25 for just a moment. Exodus chapter 25, I'm going to show you something. One of the fascinating points of research that I think is still at the stages of being in its infancy is this notion that when we come to the Garden of Eden, you read about the Garden of Eden in the opening chapters of Genesis. And the way the scriptures are laid out, it expects that you have read Genesis 1 all the way through, and then by the time you get to chapter 25, and we're going to discuss the tabernacle, that you've read everything before that. Okay? Now look at chapter 25, of Exodus. Exodus chapter 25, verse 1. He's going to tell us about the tabernacle and the layout for it, okay? It says this in 25:1. Then the Lord spoke to Moses. Notice that. That's number 1. That phrase is not used again until you get to Exodus chapter 30 in verse 11. Now, follow along with this. Exodus chapter 30, verse 11. Then the Lord spoke to Moses the second time. And he's giving him instructions on the tabernacle. The third time is in chapter 30, verse 17. Then the Lord spoke to Moses. Okay? Third time, verse 17. The fourth time is verse 22. The Lord spoke to Moses. That's number 4. Verse 34 of the same chapter, the fifth time, the Lord spoke to Moses. Number 6, verse 31, chapter 31, verse 1, the Lord spoke to Moses. And then verse 12 of chapter 31, the Lord spoke to Moses 7 times. He says to him, here are the plans I have for the erection of the tabernacle. Now, that's key, 7 times, because the Garden of Eden and the tabernacle are parallel with each other. Anybody reading from chapters 25 to 40, minus chapters 32 to 34 with the golden calf, are hearing massive echoes of the Garden of Eden. When the tabernacle is built, those who are listening to it in Hebrew, not in English, I'm going to say that, not in Hebrew, not in English, you're not going to catch it as much. Just not going to catch it as much. But those listening to it in Hebrew and reading it in Hebrew, reading it out loud and hearing it, are going to say, this is deja vu all over again. Where have I heard that before? The tabernacle, the Garden of Eden, here's the point. We, in our Western mindset, have been looking at Genesis 1, 2, and 3 to combat science. When Genesis 1, 2, and 3 was meant as an expression of a tabernacle or a place where God would dwell with his people. It was a sanctuary. So the Garden of Eden is a sanctuary. It's a place where God wants to dwell with his people. Once they're driven from that in exile, then he comes back and says in chapter 25 of Exodus, hey, I'm going to give you plans to build another place, a mobile tent where I will be in your midst. And my presence will dwell above it. Now notice this. Notice this. I said that there were 7. Did you notice? Number 7 was verse 12 of Exodus 31. And look at what comes right after it. Verse 13. Right here, as we're building the tabernacle. Speak to the children of Israel, saying, surely my Sabbaths you shall keep. What do you know? 7 segments of building, and then the building, and then we have the and then we talk about the Sabbath. Why? Because as Abraham Joshua Heschel said, what the tabernacle is to space, the Sabbath is to time. The Sabbath is a sanctuary of time. And you knew somebody was going to say this. God told us not to work. 6 days you shall labor. 7 days, on the 7th day you rest. But I'm building the tabernacle. And if ever God wanted us to work on the Sabbath, it would be to build the tabernacle. And he says, no. Even for the building of the tabernacle, stop, cease. Sacred time trumps sacred space. Okay? Sacred time trumps sacred space. So he says, look, there's these 7 phases of the tabernacle, and I want you to cease and stop even when you're building the tabernacle, even when you're doing that. Now, this tabernacle is situated right in the center of the people. And it's the dwelling place of God. It's called the Mishkan, where he dwells. From Shekinah, to dwell. And we talk in rabbinic literature of the presence of God. It was called the Shekinah. They call it, my old Pentecostal friends would call it the Shekinah. But it's Hebrew Shekinah. It's from this word Shekinah, to dwell. And he would sit enthroned above it in a pillar of fire by night and in a cloud by day. And this was the presence of God amongst his people. And it was really a reestablishment of the Garden of Eden. It was now the Garden of Eden in microcosm, situated amongst and amidst the people. I have no time to go over the notes, but I want to point something out to you. In Israel today, if you go just up from the temple, by the way, if you go along the wall, the tunnel, that's along the base of the, now it's called the third temple, in a sense. We have Solomon built the temple that we just discussed in 1 Kings. So we have the tabernacle, then we have the temple. Then the temple is, in a sense, refurbished over a period of time. Herod takes the Temple Mount and expands it. Today the Temple Mount is about 38 acres. Okay, it's huge. And if you go along the tunnel that's at the base of the western wall, there are stones that are the size, almost the size of this room right here. And they are placed on top of each other where you can't even get a dime between them. And they still don't know how they did it. These stones are huge. The foundation stones for the temple. You go up on the Temple Mount, about 38 acres. It's huge. You easily hold 50, 60,000 people, easily. Okay, at any one given time, without a problem. Now, here's what's interesting. The menorah is interesting, and I've got more research to do on the menorah. There's a lot of research to do on the menorah. But if you go to the Temple Institute, which also is right up the hill from the Temple Mount, there's a menorah now that sits there under glass. It's huge. We know that the Solomonic menorahs were basically about this height, okay, and number of them. Well, they made it. If you read the text, they were supposed to make them out of what? Pure gold. Okay. So this particular menorah, the Temple Institute was making it, and they made it and they overlaid it with gold. It wasn't really beaten out with just pure gold. So somebody kind of came along and pointed it out to them and said, "Look, you can't just overlay it. You have to have pure gold." And if you notice, the tabernacle has 3 places. You have the most holy place, you have the holy place, and then you have the general area. Okay, so there's gradations of holiness. The closer you get to the Ark of the Covenant, so you have this ring of holiness, and it says this, that he sits enthroned above the cherubim, that this ark is his footstool. Okay? That's the point of the ark. The ark is his footstool. He sits enthroned above it. And these cherubim, the first time we find these cherubim is in Genesis chapter 3, verse 24. We don't know exactly what they look like. We have artistic depictions of them in ancient Near Eastern iconographic literature, but we don't really know. No, we don't have like a snapshot. We didn't have cameras. We have pictures that they wrote. Okay, and very interesting description of these. But we know this cherubim has a flaming sword. Okay, and these cherubim guard the holiness of God. And the very fact that you have a cherubim, that's one of those other things that I mentioned earlier. The very fact that you have a cherubim in the Garden of Eden, and then you have them again in the tabernacle, is one of those little clues that tell you, you're going, okay, this is both the same. This is now the Garden of Eden, so to speak, come down. Any questions or comments? Because there's a lot of material that we really going to get to, but there's a lot of stuff here. There's a lot of stuff in this area. Any questions or comments you'd like to make?
It's just amazing how involved it is. I mean,
Absolutely.
I mean, and who else could be the one who planned it but God? Because
Yeah.
in our minds, we could never.
Yeah. And I want to make this point. I'm glad you said something. I put in the notes. It's called a tavnit. He tells to Moses. He says to Moses, "I want you to go up on the mountain, and I want you to." By the way, angels are there with Moses. We find that out in Hebrew scriptures that the Torah is mediated by angels. So angels are up there, and he says to Moses, "I'm going to show you the pattern that I want you to use, the blueprint. I'm going to give you the blueprint for the tabernacle. But this blueprint comes from, in a sense, the tabernacle in heaven. It's already been built up there. So what we have here, in a sense, is meant to mirror image or mimic what we have there. So I'm going to give you this tavnit, this pattern, this blueprint, because I want you to have my rule and my reign on this earth, just like you have it in heaven." Yeah.
Considering Moses' age, there's no minor miracle that God impressed on his mind, and he remembered to minute detail
Yeah.
how to do this.
Yeah.
I
Absolutely.
mean, it's not a simple little task. I mean, it was, everything had to be just right.
Right. Yeah, and you'll find, one of the things, go back to this thing here, one of the things you'll find is that certain things that God says about, many things that God says about the tabernacle, you cannot reduplicate. Okay, you cannot reduplicate. Some things he says you can, some things he says you can't. For instance, one of the things you cannot reduplicate is, you cannot reduplicate the oil that is going to be placed inside the menorah. Nobody is supposed to try to reduplicate that. This is just for the lighting of the menorah. Okay? Then he says, though, however, the high priest will have on his headband the thread of tekelet, a patil tekelet, which is interesting. The only other place where patil tekelet is used is now Numbers chapter 15, 37 to 41, where every Israelite is told, you should have a patil tekelet in your tzitzit. So everybody is supposed to have this tekelet because it's one of the three primary colors of the tabernacle. Tola'at, Argaman, and tekelet. One of the three primary colors. Those are the colors. So everybody gets in their garment just, you can, one thread. Not a whole garment, but you get a thread to connect you with this tabernacle. One of the importances of the tzitzit is that it connects you physically with the tabernacle and the high priest. Yes.
I've got two questions. When you said cherubim, that's cherub, right?
Yeah, cherubim. Yeah.
A rabbi told me in the synagogue, he said that if you were to put an idol in your house, you could put a lion. And I was thinking about when King Solomon had his the temple, he had two cherubim statues.
Yeah.
But it's an idol, right?
I don't think so. Yeah, I don't think so.
So we could have two lions in our house? Statue?
Yeah, I don't see that those are. Yeah, I don't see. If they're not, you can have them in pictures for sure. One might quibble over the issue of something carved, but a representation in art, as far as a wall painting, if it's flattened, you can't really.
But this rabbi said you could have a statue of lions.
I'd be hesitant to go that route. Yeah, I'd be hesitant on that as well. Picture, yes. In a carved image, I'd be much more hesitant. Yeah.
Just say that Israel believes that's the only carving you can have as a lion.
Yeah, it's interesting that they have, again, right beside the menorah that's in the plaza, there is a huge, and it's right outside the temple institute, is a huge life-sized lion. So I don't know why, I'd have to do some research as to why they think a lion can be portrayed in life-size form.
These all have two statues there.
Yeah. Yeah, there's interesting things about the temple that are fascinating. So it seems that the temple is different than the tabernacle in some of in the size of it, the layout of it, and some of the things that were done. One of the things that was not good, in my estimation, is by the time of Herod, when he revamps and rebuilds the temple, he creates the court of the women, the court of the Gentiles. He segments it to where only those of those, if you were the Gentiles, you can only go that far. If you're a woman, you can only go so far. So he had segmented the tabernacle, obviously the temple, which was never part of what Solomon does. Now, I want to say this. I want to end with this. We got to end. Look at Isaiah chapter. 1 Kings 8. 1 Kings 8. Really quick. And this is important because it's Solomon dedicating the temple. This is his dedication of the temple in 1 Kings 8. His dedicatory prayer. I want to show you what he says that I think is fascinating. This is 1 Kings chapter 8, verse 41. Now remember, he's dedicating the temple. That's the context. Here's part of the prayer. He says this in verse 41. Moreover, concerning a foreigner, and he's talking here about the word no creed. Same word used in Isaiah 56. An absolute foreigner, a Gentile. How do we know that? Because look how he describes him. Who is not of your people Israel, but has come from a far country for your name's sake. For they will hear of your great name and your strong hand and your outstretched arm. That's language of the Exodus. You're going to tell the story of the Exodus so much that other nations will hear about it. And they'll want to be involved. Notice what he says. When he comes and prays toward this temple, here in heaven your dwelling place, and do according to all for which the foreigner calls to you, that all peoples of the earth may know your name and fear you, as do your people Israel, and that they may know that this temple which I have built is called by your name. Then what does Isaiah 56 say? My house should be called a house of prayer for all nations. It was meant to be a place that everybody would come, and everybody would be a part of it. It was meant to be inclusionary, not exclusionary. All right. Take your skewers. We're going to do the Eleno on page 95. Stand with me, please. Page 95, additional Eleno.